Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive structural puzzle. How do incredibly diverse, multi-ethnic nations actually govern themselves without, well, completely falling apart? It's a fascinating question, and we're going to dive right into the precise mechanics of how deeply divided societies can achieve real, long-lasting stability.
Just imagine living next door to someone your entire life, but you never share a meal, a language, or a belief system. How in the world do you build a country together? This isn't just some hypothetical thought experiment, right? For a lot of nations, this is the fundamental reality of their everyday existence, and it's a reality that requires a very specific kind of political architecture to keep things from collapsing into chaos.
This brings us to a really famous observation made by the scholar J.S. Furnival way back in 1939. He perfectly captured the core dilemma of these divided communities sharing a single geography with one simple, striking phrase. He said they mix but do not combine. Think about that. They exist in the exact same physical space but remain entirely distinct.
Furnival actually coined a term for this, a plural society. It's basically a society where two or more different communities live within the same exact political unit, but they absolutely do not integrate. We saw this vividly in historical examples, like colonial Malaya. You had Malay, Chinese, and Indians all sharing one country, but they stubbornly maintained their own separate cultural identities, languages, and lifestyles, instead of blending into one common national culture.
So, here's our agenda for understanding this dynamic. First, we'll look at what a plural society actually is. Second, the anatomy of a divided society. Third, the consociational democracy solution. And finally, the conditions for democratic success.
Starting with Section 1. What is a plural society? Let's take a look at the core problem.
Furnival identified 4 key elements that define this setup. First, communities live side by side without integrating. Second, because they have totally different interests and values and lack mutual understanding, they have this natural inclination towards conflict, especially over resources. Third, order is actually maintained by outside force, not consensus. And fourth, they really only interact in the marketplace. Let's actually zoom in on that last point because it's super important.
See, in the marketplace, these different ethnic groups easily cross paths to buy and sell goods, right? But the second the business transaction is over, they retreat back to completely isolated social, educational, and religious lives. They'll trade together, sure, but they attend different schools, live in entirely different neighborhoods, and practice different religions. So they trade together, but socially, they live worlds apart.
And because there's zero natural integration or cooperation here, social order doesn't just happen organically. In colonial Malaya, for instance, law and order basically only existed because the British colonial administration enforced it from the top down. The whole society was held together by strict administrative control, not by any shared agreement among the people who actually lived there. As you can guess, it's an incredibly fragile setup.
Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Divided Society and the Symptoms of Deep Separation. If we look closely at Malaya, this deep separation manifested in almost every single aspect of daily life. Socially, you had separate vernacular schools. Culturally, everyday communication happened in entirely different languages. Malay, Chinese dialects, Tamil. Even their beliefs resulted in completely separate celebrations, like Hari Raya, Chinese New Year, and Deepavali. Because of all these silos, strong primordial sentiments, that intense loyalty to your own ethnic origins, naturally took precedence over any kind of unified national identity.
Which brings us to Section 3, the consociational democracy solution, or the political cure. So the massive structural challenge is this. If that colonial, top-down force is removed, how does this society survive without instantly collapsing into conflict? The answer is a brilliant political cure called consociational democracy. It essentially replaces external force with internal consensus, using 4 distinct pillars of political engineering: a grand coalition of elites, a mutual veto, proportional representation, and segmental autonomy. Let's break these down because they're actually pretty ingenious.
First up is the Grand Coalition. Consociational democracy requires political leaders from all the different ethnic communities to literally team up and govern collectively. What's crucial to grasp here is that these leaders are often intense political rivals. They have to swallow their pride and recognize that cooperation is literally the only path to stability. A perfect historical example is Malaysia's Alliance Party, which brought together leaders from UMNO, MCA, and MIC. They represented totally different groups, but deliberately chose to govern as one unit.
This second pillar is the mutual veto. This one is absolutely critical.
It gives each major community the power to block decisions that threatened its fundamental interests. Think of this veto power as a built-in safety valve. It essentially forces groups to sit down and negotiate on the really sensitive issues, like religion or language, instead of just allowing a demographic majority to steamroll over the minorities.
Then we have the third pillar, proportional representation. This ensures that government jobs, parliamentary seats, and resources are distributed fairly, based strictly on the population size of each community. It guarantees that everyone gets a mathematical slice of the pie in government institutions. When every single group has a guaranteed seat at the table, it completely prevents any one community from feeling like they've been shut out of the system.
The fourth and final pillar is segmental autonomy. This basically means allowing different communities to independently manage things that are deeply personal to them, like specific cultural, educational, or religious matters. Going back to our Malaya example, this meant allowing the existence of vernacular schools and protecting diverse religious practices. It lets these groups preserve their distinct identities while still safely participating in the larger political framework.
Okay, Section 4, Conditions for Democratic Success, the catalyst for stability.
Now, as elegant as this whole system sounds, this delicate balancing act doesn't just happen on its own. For it to actually thrive, 4 very specific, favorable conditions need to be in place. First, communities need a degree of segmental isolation, but they absolutely must have recognized leaders who can negotiate for them. Second, there has to be a multiple balance of power, meaning the demographic scales need to be balanced so perfectly that no single ethnic group has overwhelming numbers to just dominate everyone else.
Third, and this is kind of ironic, the presence of common external threats. Shared challenges actually promote collective action rather than ethnic conflict. A shared struggle, like the historical push for national independence, literally forces divided communities to put their internal differences aside and cooperate to survive.
And finally, the fourth condition, elite accommodation. Ultimately, this entire consociational system hinges on this one tradition. Political leaders must actively choose the incredibly difficult work of compromise and negotiation over the easy, tempting path of division. They have to prioritize the long-term stability of the country. Honestly, it's exhausting, endless consensus building, but without leaders willing to constantly accommodate one another, the whole system just falls apart. So, this brings us to the end of our explainer, and leaves us with a pretty powerful question to reflect on. When we look at the diverse nations of today, or even our own local communities, we have to ask ourselves, do we merely mix in the marketplace, tolerating each other just for economic convenience? Or do we actively do the hard work to combine, to build structures of real consensus and mutual respect? The stability of our incredibly diverse world depends entirely on how we answer that question. Do we just tolerate, or do we actually build? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.